All right, I'm going to get going, everyone. Okay, thank you so much for being here. It's amazing to see you all. This is SolidariTee's third conference, then and now the Refugee Crisis since 2015. This is the first time we've been able to do a conference in person, so it's really amazing to see so many people actually here. But we're also live streaming the whole thing, so welcome to everybody watching online. It's amazing to have you with us. I'm going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, if you're looking for the bathroom, it's through that door and just up to the right. The bathrooms are gender neutral, so you can use whichever one you like. If you're looking for snacks, I think most people have found them, but they're at the table at the back. Please help yourself. We're going to be taking breaks between every speaker, so make the most of those. And at lunchtime, we'll put out food in the same place. Everything's vegetarian, and there are vegan and gluten-free options, but please note that we have made them all in the same kitchen, so we can't guarantee that there won't be traces. As you can see, we're taking photos. If you wouldn't like your image to be used, please just come and tell me, and I'll put your name down and make sure that it isn't. And finally, we want to keep this discussion illuminating, but also respectful. So please remember when you're asking questions that there are people here that have lived experience. Just bear that in mind. A few thank yous. Firstly, Rainbow Wave, who've let us use this venue. It's beautiful. We're really, really grateful. Secondly, to George Kirby and Orlando Timmerman, who have sorted out all of our live streaming. It's actually really complicated, and we couldn't have done it, so we're very grateful to them. And finally, to the people from SolidariTee that have made this happen. So that's Izzy Ponsonby, Elizabeth Wild, Minnie Life, Becca Young, Anna Marshall, and Alexa Nettie. Thank you so much for all of your work. Okay, so before I hand you over to our first speaker, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the rationale behind this conference. So the first thing you might have noticed is every time we talk about the refugee crisis, we put it in quotation marks. The refugee crisis is the term that's been mostly used to describe people arriving in Europe since 2015. They've lived largely in camps, often in crowded and unsafe conditions, and it's been normal to wait for months or years for the outcome of an asylum claim. We don't really like this term crisis because we think it has some misleading implications. Firstly, crisis suggests a single phenomenon. But the situation of displaced people in Europe is an outcome of a whole combination of different crises and failures of government. So firstly, we have complex and dangerous situations in home countries, which we shouldn't think of ourselves as removed from. Western governments are often highly implicated. We also have enormous refugee populations in neighbouring countries to conflict zones. They're often very welcoming to refugee populations, but they don't have the resources to host them, and they receive very little help. Thirdly, there's a lack of refugee resettlement schemes. So the idea of a resettlement scheme is that a wealthier country in North America or Europe takes refugees from a country that's overburdened. It's a great idea in theory, but in principle, the schemes that are in place are very, very small. So the reality for refugees is that if they want to come to Europe, they really have to come here under their own steam. And finally, we have really just countless barriers to asylum seekers in Western countries. We have unfair asylum processes, physical barriers to entry at borders, and policy changes that are making it harder and harder to claim asylum in Europe. So I think one case in point of this misuse of the term crisis is the rising numbers of asylum seekers who've been crossing the English Channel in small boats. Government ministers like Priti Patel like to talk about the need to stop crossings, but government policy actually created the need for crossings like this. So you have to be in the UK to claim asylum, and there's no humanitarian visa, so people who want to claim asylum here have to somehow make it here. The safer route from France to the UK is through the Channel Tunnel, but there's been a huge increase in policing of that route in recent years, and the very predictable outcome of that is that people go over the channel instead, they take the boat. So this is an outcome that's really been created. It's not just a natural crisis that's arisen. We should remember at every stage here that people don't get onto dangerous boats just for no reason. They make journeys because they're fleeing war and persecution, and they really deserve to be met with respect and compassion, but instead we resist them at every stage. So another reason we don't really like the term crisis is that it implies that an overwhelming number of people are arriving in Europe. And that's just not the case. Under international law, people have a right to claim asylum in a country if they have a well-founded fear of persecution. That's in the Geneva Conventions. If Europe came together, we could uphold that right. We have enough resources, enough space, enough money. If there's any point in international law and cooperation at all, then surely it should be to protect refugees. Protecting human rights is non-negotiable, and we're in the 5th richest country in the world. So there's really no excuse. So in this conference, we want to look back to 2015 and also forward to the future. We want to ask what's changed for refugees and asylum seekers and what hasn't changed. We're seeking as broad a perspective as possible, so we're speaking to lawyers, humanitarian aid workers, journalists, amongst others. We hope that you find today useful. We also really want you to find it hopeful. It's easy to feel disillusioned, especially watching the news at the moment, but there are things that we can do to help uphold the rights of displaced people, and we hope that today helps you feel empowered to know what those are. So before I finish, I have to tell you a little bit about SolidariTee. We're a student-led charity, and we operate via 2 main means. Firstly, grant giving. So we raise money through selling our solidarities and events like this. And all of that money goes into grants to NGOs who are supplying empowering sustainable aid to refugees and asylum seekers. Mostly that's meant legal aid, which gives people a fair shot in an asylum interview, but we have gone down other routes as well. And we also aim to raise awareness of the injustices faced by refugees and try to combat some of the harmful myths and stereotypes that so often surround them in the media. So you're already doing an awful lot for us by being here, but if you would like to support us further, we have a whole bunch of teas here. If you'd like to buy one, come and find one of us. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. We're going to have a keynote from Petra Molnar to start us off. Petra's a lawyer and an anthropologist who focuses on the impact of technology at borders. She co-runs the Refugee Law Lab at York University in Canada, and she's currently writing a book called Artificial Borders, AI, Surveillance, and Border Tech Experiments. So we're honoured to have her here.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'm having a little bit of feedback from your main feed, so I hope that I'm coming across clear, but please let me know if I need to change anything on my end. But thank you again for the kind invitation to come and speak with you today. I should also note, I'm actually calling, and here's some of my weird background, from the Ukrainian border. I'm a human rights lawyer that focuses mostly on immigration issues, and some colleagues of mine and I are here to collect evidence, mostly of racial profiling at the border, but also of the general situation. So I just want to note that I know this is a situation that's on the mind of many, particularly those who are at the conference today, but it would be, I was struggling, I guess, in terms of how to start my presentation because I wanted to talk to you about my most recent work, which has a lot to do with surveillance technologies at the border. But given the conflict that's currently ongoing, it felt very strange to not acknowledge that in some way. So I thought perhaps I would just take a few minutes at the beginning to tell you a bit about some of my experiences there. Also, sorry, there's a technical problem. I just tried to share my screen to show some photos, but I don't seem to be able to do that. So perhaps I will just talk and we can resolve that as I'm perhaps reflecting on some of the things that I've been seeing. Currently, I'm at the Slovak-Ukrainian border, but my colleagues and I were at the Hungarian. It's a chaotic situation in many ways, and people are having a variety of different experiences as they're crossing, of course. Again, for me as a human rights lawyer, looking at the way that immigration is experienced by different groups, it's important to acknowledge that, of course, the amazing amount of solidarity that we're seeing around all sorts of different border points along the region is really amazing. For example, like this refugee center that was set up in a very small village of Lanya in Hungary is also differentially experienced based on people depending on where they come from. And you, for example, see there's a pile of baby diapers and toys and all sorts of different resources for people who are crossing. But I am here on behalf and in partnership with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Discrimination. We're collecting some evidence of folks of racialized background who are crossing the border as refugees also, and some of their differentiated experiences. And I wanted to share with you this photograph. And I should also note my photo policy, as you'll notice, and I think it's in line with your conference too. I never show images of people in distress, and I work closely with my photographer colleagues as well, where we really take to heart to not further victimize people in these situations. So I, for example, never show faces unless it's a person that's directly working with us in some way, shape, or form. But I do have permission to share this photo with you. This is Calvin. He's 26 years old. He is a student, medical student from Western Nigeria. He's actually a practicing doctor there already, and he's been doing a specialization in surgery in a city in Ukraine. And I met him at a train station here in Hungary, and we spoke a bit about his experience. And for me, what was really moving is the fact that he still had keys to his flat in his pocket, and all he was able to take with him was a backpack and his medical degree. And there's so many medical students and dentistry students and students from across the world who are studying in Ukraine that are fleeing across the borders. And as we've now already seen in the media, finally, there's some examination of some of the racism and discrimination that they have been facing too. So all that to say, this situation is showing, I think, both a tremendous amount of solidarity, but also really, really problematic ways that people are once again experiencing the violent border regimes that are unfortunately so common around Europe and around the world as well. So perhaps, I mean, it does seem a bit artificial to talk about artificial intelligence and borders with you today, but I am going to try my best to link it with the current situation as well, and the kind of arbitrary and very specific violence that is perpetrated around borders around the world. So perhaps just a little bit more about me. I'm a human rights lawyer, but I'm also an anthropologist, so I work in a methodology that is slow and deep, and that also requires for me to be present in a lot of the spaces where this border violence occurs. And for the last few years, I've been studying the impact of new technologies on people on the move and people crossing borders. They started off in Canada, but then I've expanded into trying to understand how Fortress Europe is increasingly becoming digitized. And most recently, I was at the US-Mexico border, which I think is also an instructive place to begin for us. This, for example, is the border wall in Nogales, which is separating Mexico from the United States. Because I think when we're trying to understand what is happening around the world with this kind of sharpening of borders, and trying to understand the impact of how immigration policies are impacting people on the move, it's really important to think about the context that we are dealing with. And I think, again, the Ukrainian situation is complicating it to some extent, and yet it's also showing some really, really problematic tropes that we can perhaps tease apart together today. And for me, I look at migration management from a technology angle. So I'm looking at things like AI, lie detectors, surveillance drones, a variety of different automated decision-making that's making its way into managing the border. But again, it's about the broader ecosystem in which a lot of these practices are developed. And this is an ecosystem which is increasingly replete with criminalization of migration, anti-migrant sentiments, and practices such as pushbacks, which we're seeing around Europe, which are leading to thousands of deaths already. So I was actually, before this conflict broke out, I was at the US-Mexico border. And I was there as part of this long-term project that we're doing, trying to understand how this technology is impacting people on the move. And the United States-Mexico frontier is a really interesting one because it's a much more visible manifestation of how this technology looks and feels. I mean, you see these towers, you can literally drive up there. This is a surveillance tower by an Israeli surveillance company that has been dotted throughout the Sonora Desert. And you can literally see it. It's a little bit more hidden in some way in the European space, but in the US-Mexico space, it's very proudly there. So these surveillance towers essentially sweep the Sonora Desert, trying to expand the dragnet of surveillance further and further afield to prevent people from being able to reach a place where they might be able to claim refugee status, for example. And again, this is done under the idea that we need to have more surveillance to prevent people from coming, to find people, and sometimes even it's tied in these like really problematic tropes of making people safer in the desert. But I kid you not, when I was there, literally in the Sonora Desert, The Department of Homeland Security also announced that they were going to be rolling out these so-called robo-dogs that you're currently seeing. It's a military-grade type technology. It essentially, some of them are armed, some of them are not. It can run very fast. It can withstand all sorts of force, including being kicked. And it's a military type technology that's already also been used in law enforcement in a variety of jurisdictions. So it's very dystopic. It seems like something out of a science fiction TV show, but unfortunately it is very real. And again, what is, I think, a really problematic and yet important point to think about is that oftentimes these technologies are being introduced under the pretense of making the border safer. But really, it's not just about technology, it's about the deaths that will be caused, because thousands of people have already perished making some of these dangerous journeys. You know, when we're talking about the US-Mexico border, for example, like Mr. Alvarado, who was a young husband and father from Central America, whose memorial site we visited in the Sonora Desert here. And again, surveillance and smart borders have been proven, in fact, to not deter people from making dangerous crossings, right? Instead, people are forced to change their routes towards more treacherous, uninhabited terrain, which actually then leads to a loss of life, both in the US-Mexico desert corridor, but also along the Mediterranean and Aegean seas that's much closer to Europe. And again, if these technological experiments, these sharpening of borders continue, I mean, in the not so distant future, people like Mr. Alvarado and thousands of others will be pursued by high-speed military-grade technologies like robodogs. And this is unfortunately not just a science fiction scenario, this is now a reality. I also like to include this picture because I think it just shows the absurdity of border walls. It's literally, the wall just stops and you can climb a hill and then you're in Mexico. So I did that and I went to see what it feels like. And it's a very absurd yet very real world manifestation of the arbitrariness of borders. But of course, this situation that I'm describing in the Sonora Desert is not just unique to that context, but I want to bring it back to Europe because this is perhaps of most relevance to you today. What you're seeing here is the manifestation of this digitization of Fortress Europe that we've been seeing in the last couple of years. I'm based in Greece most of the time now, and I've been documenting the rise of these prison-like refugee camps that have been making their way onto the Aegean Islands here in Greece. This, for example, is from the opening of the refugee camp on the island of Kos. It's very prison-like. I mean, it's, you know, surrounded by barbed wire. There is cameras, drones, all sorts of sensors. But I think oftentimes when we talk about technology and surveillance, it's really easy to talk in abstract terms. Although, you know what, maybe not so much, because now we are talking about robodogs and things that are very sharp and visceral for all of us, I think, to imagine. But sometimes it does seem like, you know, we're talking about things that are harder to see. They're a little bit more difficult to kind of wrap our minds around. But for me, you know, as a human rights lawyer and an anthropologist, what I try and do is foreground the lived experiences of the people who are at the sharpest edges of this technological experimentation. And for me, what sometimes stays with me, for example, is this young mother from Afghanistan that I met on the eve of the opening of one of these camps on the island of Samos, and before she was forcibly transferred there. And I just remember she hurriedly really typed out this message to me, and it says, if we go there, we will go crazy. And it's not hard to imagine why. I mean, this is what the new camps look like. Again, layers of barbed wire, algorithmic motion detection and risk detection surveillance, fingerprint scanners, and even they're piloting, for example, virtual reality technology to train their officers on all sorts of ways to monitor people inside. But again, I think what's important to talk about, maybe I'll just leave this photo up there for now, is that there are real, not only is it kind of a dehumanization element to the way that this is playing out and making the daily life of people difficult, we can also use a human rights framing to try and really get at some of the ways that this is kind of manifesting, and perhaps also ways that we can challenge it. I mean, for example, when we look at the ways that different technologies are making the border sharper and more difficult, for me, it helps to talk in concrete terms. I mean, privacy and privacy rights are really important to talk about, for example, when we talk about the introduction of vast data collection systems and biometrics in refugee camps that are collecting all sorts of information on people, which then may be shared with repressive governments that they're trying to flee. But perhaps
even more importantly, the discriminatory impacts are really, really important to think about, because of course, none of this is a neutral exercise. And migration decision-making is always political. For me, what always comes to mind is the now perhaps infamous border control experiment, which essentially is an AI type lie detector that was going to be rolled out at a variety of border points across Europe. And this AI lie detector purported to be able to tell whether or not you're telling the truth at the border based on your face. So facial recognition and emotion, micro-expression recognition on your face. But if I put on my refugee lawyer hat, or even just the human hat, I mean, it immediately makes you think about, how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication, for example? Now, I've represented people who, for a variety of reasons, cultural, religious, trauma, are maybe not able to make direct eye contact with the decision maker of an opposite gender. How can we ensure that an AI lie detector is not going to make a negative inference about someone's truthfulness based on outdated ideas of how someone is supposed to act in a stressful situation? Or perhaps even more subtly, what about the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that we know that people don't tell stories or testify in a linear way? How can an AI lie detector deal with something like that? And we, of course, know that facial recognition and technology is not neutral. It is highly biased against Black and brown faces, for example, when we talk about facial recognition. We know that the data sets that are used to kind of feed and power this technology are very, very biased and based on biased data. Algorithmic decision-making sometimes is really difficult to pull apart because this issue that often happens where an algorithm makes a decision that is difficult to render and understand. And again, I think the context here is super crucial. We're talking about immigration and refugee decision-making, something that under law is already extremely opaque and very discretionary. I always like to talk about it in this way. You can have two immigration officers look at the exact same set of evidence and render two completely different answers that are both equally valid. That's just the way that the jurisprudence has developed, the way that immigration law often works. It's very discretionary, and the decision maker oftentimes has final say, and it can be difficult to understand why a particular decision was arrived at. So imagine if we start automating certain aspects of that, certain parts of this opaque and discretionary decision-making system. And again, a concrete example might be helpful because I know a lot of you are based in the UK. So a few years ago, it came to light that over 7,000 foreign students were wrongfully deported out of the United Kingdom based on an algorithm that made a mistake and accused them of cheating on a language acquisition test. So all the issues aside, let's pretend that you're one of those students whose whole life was upended and you wanted to challenge this mistake in a court of law. Who would you be challenging? Would it be the coder who put this algorithm together? Would it be the immigration officer using the algorithm for her or his decision? Would it be the algorithm itself? Does an algorithm have legal personality in a court of law? Sounds a bit facetious, but we are getting there. Like, these are the questions that are going to be animating the way that courts in particular are going to have to start dealing with more and more life-altering decisions made as a result of biased and discriminatory technology, particularly with far-reaching impacts, such as in refugee and immigration decision-making. But, I always like to kind of end on a more perhaps philosophical, theoretical note, because what I find really troubling is, again, we're seeing this type of technological experimentation occur, particularly at and around the border, which, again, just to reiterate, is already an opaque, discretionary, and high-risk environment for these technologies to play out in. And, why is that, right? Why are they always tested out and specifically playing out kind of along the margins? I mean, in my work, I argue that this is, in fact, very deliberate. Because again, it's an opaque and discretionary world of border enforcement and immigration decision-making. And also structures which are underpinned, of course, by intersecting systemic racism and historical discrimination for groups that are migrating and on the move. So these impacts are really real. This is not some sort of theoretical exercise. But perhaps it's also about broader questions that we have to ask ourselves. Whose priorities matter when we start innovating at and around the border? And what's really troubling too is the increasing role of the private sector in all of this, because oftentimes states who really want to use this technology and what some people have called the AI arms race in the world to try and increasingly automate and create more surveillance at and around the border, they need private sector companies in these public-private partnerships to help them develop and deploy this technology, because oftentimes states are not able to do this themselves in-house. But of course, the private sector has a very different agenda and a very different bottom line. And there's big money to be made in big tech at the border. But again, whose priorities matter when we start innovating and introducing technology into the border? Like, why are we, for example, developing violent sound cannons that are being rolled out at the Greek-Turkey border, or the AI lie detector that I mentioned to be used against people migrating? Why are we not using AI tools to root out racist border guards? There's a very clear priority that is at play here. And that priority is to make borders sharper and harder and to turn more towards border enforcement as the kind of foundational idea of what we are trying to do here. But really, I mean, at the end of the day, this conversation isn't just about technology, right? It is about these broader questions around which communities get to participate in conversations around proposed interventions, and which groups become testing grounds for border tech experiments. So none of this is neutral, is what I'm trying to say. And my work, which is now based on years, it's amazing where the time goes, of on-the-ground research and really hundreds of conversations with people who are themselves at the sharpest edges of these technological experiments at the border. It's very clear also that the current lack of global governance around this creates this kind of perfect laboratory for high-risk experiments, making people on the move, migrants, refugees, immigrants, a testing ground. Because really right now, very little regulation and law exists around this type of border tech. For those of you who are interested in the legal side of things, we have domestic and international privacy legislation. The European Union, of course, has the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, but it doesn't specifically deal with, for example, artificial intelligence or border technology specifically. I mean, I should mention, last year, the European Union tabled proposed regulation on artificial intelligence, which is the first document of its kind that will regionally attempt to regulate something as amorphous and difficult to wrap our minds around as artificial intelligence. And it does recognize that border tech, so to speak, is a high-risk category, but it does not go as far as to ban certain uses of it. And so some really amazing groups, such as the European Digital Rights, EDRI, and a few others, are really pushing to try and recognize that these technologies are violent, that they impact real people, and that they perpetuate historical oppression and systemic racism. Because really, at the end of the day, we desperately need more regulation, oversight, and accountability over this. Because again, it's just not some sort of neutral exercise. And one last thing I will mention too, the international organizations that are involved in this in the humanitarian sector as well are complicit as well. The United Nations, the International Organization of Migration, are very, very keen to use all sorts of data-driven tools to assist with their operations. And it can seem like a worthy goal, for efficiency purposes or to render humanitarian aid in a faster, better way. But again, how do the people who are actually at the center of this feel? If, for example, you're a Syrian refugee in a Jordanian refugee camp and you have to get your irises scanned in order to get your weekly food rations, and you're not comfortable with that, what do you do? I mean, people talk about feeling dehumanized in this way, of being reduced to a data point, and yet not being able to say no because they require their weekly food rations. So your biometrics in exchange for food, that really undermines our understanding of informed consent and the ability to opt out. Imagine if you were faced with that when you go into a Waitrose or a Sainsbury's or another grocery store. People would be up in arms, but when it happens in a refugee camp, it's very, very different. Again, there's a huge power differential in the communities that we're talking about today. And it's really, really important to always keep that front of mind. Because again, technology is never neutral, and it's a political exercise. And here I would just like to end, because I know our time is brief together today, and I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. I just want to really bring it back to the current situation that's happening now. Not only is technology political, but migration is, of course, political, and the kind of responses that are put forward really, really highlight that. So earlier last year now, I was at the Polish-Belarusian border, where the situation with hundreds of people who were trapped in that horrible frozen corridor between the two countries was horrific, probably one of the worst ones I've ever seen. And I've worked all over the world on these issues. And it's still happening there. There was a corridor, for example, of 5 kilometers that human rights monitors and journalists were not allowed to enter. And yet, with this current crisis, there's a much more of an open door policy. So it's really important to question why regions and why countries have a particular response for one group of refugees versus another. And Hungary in particular is an interesting one, right? There's a fortified wall along the southern border, and an open border policy between Ukraine and Hungary. So everything is kind of coded along these lines of who gets to come where and which groups we want to keep out and which groups we want to let in. And technology, of course, plays into that because it highlights how states are able to kind of lean on some of these tools to make their jobs easier, to let some people in and shut other people out. And at the end of the day, though, it's also about this hubris of big tech, this kind of techno-solutionism thinking that some people call it, that if we use more technology, it's going to make migration management easier somehow, or even that migration is something to be managed. But at the end of the day, these kind of band-aid solutions don't really address the systemic reasons why people are marginalized, why Black and Brown people, for example, experience disproportionate violence at the border, and why they're forced to migrate in the first place. So I think I will leave it there to make sure that we have enough time for a discussion. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my scattered thoughts today. I do apologize. It has been difficult to be at the border, but I hope that I was able to share some interesting insights with you today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask what you noticed about the different uses of technology in the different regions that you've worked. So what are the differences between, for example, China, US border, and in Europe?
Really good question about the comparison between the use of technology in a place like China, for example, US and Europe. I mean, they're very different manifestations, but also all part of the same continuum. I should also preface this by saying, I'm by no means an expert on the repressive technological estate in China. I can direct you towards a colleague who's been doing really, really amazing work on particularly artificial intelligence as it's weaponized against the Uyghur population. Did a really interesting interview with him, and I was then doing some comments on the kind of global manifestations of this. But I think what's important with China is, they're a major player in the way that technology is developed and deployed, because they have so much capital to invest into, again, this kind of turn towards techno-solutionism, not just in migration or in carceral type technologies, if we're talking about what's happening in the Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs, but also just generally the kind of expectation that a person moving through the world in a place like China has when it comes to the kind of omnipresent surveillance, data gathering, and the kind of normalization of technology in the daily life of people. And what's also tricky and important to think about is that technology bleeds across borders really easily, right? It can be developed in one jurisdiction, bought by a second one, repurposed in the third one. And we're seeing this a lot, especially with repressive type technology. Even, for example, Israel is a really, really main player in all of this, where Israeli surveillance that is tested out on the West Bank, for example, is then sold and reused at the US-Mexico border. And so again, with China being such a major player in the kind of tech development, and also now with shifting geopolitical relations, it's going to be really important to see how much normalization of surveillance is there going to be as massive amounts of capital start flowing more and more into this space. So really, I mean, in terms of a comparison, perhaps some of the most sharpest manifestations are present in places like China, but it is also on a continuum. And again, some of the technology that makes its way into the US space and into the European space. What's interesting with Europe, and I'm there with this question, is that, of course, we do have more regulation, or hopefully will in the next coming years on some of this. So it might be able to curb some of the most sharpest manifestations of this. But again, it's that logic that underpins this. It's logic that movement has to be controlled, that borders are something to be enforced, that technology is a viable tool through which to do this, and that the power relations that are in play don't matter, that it's about the powerful political economy actors who get to set the agenda. And this kind of, again, normalization of technology. I always like to say it this way. It's like we've skipped a few steps, right? We are now talking about, finally, the human rights impacts of tech and surveillance and bordering and all of that. We never really had the conversation about how do we feel as a society to automate this stuff in the first place. And it's not just about immigration, it's about criminal justice, it's about welfare, it's about just the expectation that an individual or community has when dealing with the state. We've kind of skipped that step and we've started to automate, and then when people like lawyers or journalists or civil society find out about all these kind of egregious human rights abuses, then we go back and start thinking, oh, okay, like this is maybe not the best idea. But we never had that foundational conversation about what the state should or shouldn't be doing. So it's really, really important to look at it kind of from that global perspective too. So I see there's another question, and I was asked to read it out, so I will read it out. Would you advocate for a complete moratorium on this type of technology, or a cautious approach which does use such technologies? So I can give you my personal opinion, and then I will maybe talk about some strategic advocacy on this. So for those of you who know my work, I am very pro-open borders, and definitely would advocate more along the spectrum of an abolitionist type perspective when it comes to these technologies. Most particularly because, again, I think it has to do with what I kind of tried to illuminate in the last answer. The fact that, again, we kind of skipped the step of talking about the impact, the way that this plays out, the kind of conversations around transparency, accountability, and even participatory approaches to what is happening in society and how do affected groups talk about that. Since we haven't had that, I definitely think a moratorium is something that should be on the table. But this is perhaps where then my pragmatic lawyer hat comes on. And it does, unfortunately, already feel that we are kind of past that point, that calling for a moratorium, a blanket moratorium or a blanket ban, is likely not going to get us anywhere. I mean, I know that sounds very cynical, and I don't mean to be cynical, but I am also trying to look at it from the kind of, again, the geopolitical appetite for these things. I mean, we can't even agree on banning autonomous weapons in war, for example, right? There's been lots of conversations and lots of advocacy around this very particular manifestation, and we can't even agree on that. So when you then zoom out more and look at border technologies, and border management and migration is probably one of the most contentious issues in our world today, chances are that there probably would also not be an agreement. And I don't even mean, on different sides of the political spectrum. I just also mean among people who work on this. Some people believe that this technology can make immigration processing more efficient, for example. So I know this is a bit of a non-answer because I think on some level, it's possible to advocate for both, I suppose. And this is really part of the kind of abolitionist ethic anyway, right? That we can dream of a better world and push for a different kind of paradigm, while also understanding that there are certain things that can be perhaps directly changed today. So it's always a bit of a tough exercise, and it's one actually that I am engaged in daily these days as we try and figure out like what to call for with this new regulation on artificial intelligence. So for example, to give you a direct example with immigration, there's all sorts of different categories under that act. And my colleagues and I don't agree, right? Like for me, for example, I'm much more on the let's ban everything and let's not make arbitrary distinctions also between, let's say, like an immigration application and a refugee application. Because in the real world, and I think this is where my law practice helps me, I mean, people slip between categories of status all the time, right? And just because you're a refugee one day doesn't mean that you might not be an economic migrant the next day. And these categories are so kind of fluid anyways. Our law really struggles with fluidity though, so that's part of the problem too. But anyway, so for me, for example, I would say let's just, have a much more broader approach and look at the human rights risks. But some colleagues say, no, we need to really pick up the sharpest issues and really push for that and then deal with the rest. So there's a lot of talk, for example, to ban facial recognition, but be okay with population prediction modeling, which could be used for interdictions in seas at the Mediterranean, for example. So it's debatable whether that's any less violent or not than facial recognition at the border. So all that to say, very long-winded answer, it's very complicated. There are some calls that will be actually coming out in the next few weeks that if you are interested in learning more about this and perhaps, signing on or finding ways to advocate on this, there will be more opportunities, but it's definitely not clear-cut. And it is a really, really complicated area that is hard to get right, I think, when it comes to what to call for and what could potentially actually be accomplished when it comes to the policy circles and their appetite for technology. So there's another question, another legal one. Currently, is there any international law or restriction on the use of AI technology in this way? So the clear answer, I would say, is no. Some of us have tried to stretch the current international legal regime. I can send you a paper on this if you're interested. Because, you can use the international legal documents and laws that are in place to open them up a little bit and say, okay, well, automated decision-making touches on, the fundamental right to not be discriminated against, or freedom of expression, or freedom of movement, or, discrimination against women, all these things, where there is no kind of integrated specific law or restriction on AI. I mean, there's also what's known as the Rugby Principles. They speak more to the kind of ways that businesses are supposed to be acting in private sector responsibilities under the legal regime when technologies are developed. So some people have been trying to kind of advocate under that umbrella too. But specifically when it comes to artificial intelligence, no. Again, the proposed regulation on AI in Europe will be really, really helpful. Of course, that will be a regional document, but I think it will perhaps give lawyers a little bit of backing on which to pin legal challenges or just even thinking around responsibility and redress. But it also, not to do like the lawyer thing and answer a question with a question, but I will. I don't know. Do you think there should be an international covenant on AI or non-discrimination? People are very divided on this because, as we of course know, and I know this might sound weird coming from like an international human rights lawyer, but international human rights law is not a perfect system either. It's replete with, inaction in many ways, which we're seeing, I think now, given the current conflict in Ukraine. It's also very political. It's a very Western, kind of neoliberal, individualistic understanding of how things work too, centering an individual as a rights holder at the center, and foreclosing the ability, for example, of communities to advocate for collective rights, the collective right to privacy or collective right to not be discriminated by AI. So all that to say, I don't know if there was a new international law or a regulation on AI, what that would do. Again, it's an open question, and it's a really interesting, I think, conversation that we're having, because hopefully what you're seeing is that this is a very much a developing area, both in terms of research, but also in terms of law and governance and how this is playing out. This really is the kind of frontier of human rights lawyering, and we're all a little bit confused about where this is going. So I think it'll be interesting to see in the next couple of years if there will be an appetite on part of the kind of international jurisprudence to do anything about it. Last thing I will say, though, again, if for those of you who are interested, there have been some, outfits at the UN, for example, that have put forward fairly strong statements on AI and border tech in particular. My colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur, Professor Tendai Achiume, who's a critical race theorist and a lawyer in California also, she put out a really amazing report in 2020 looking at systemic racism, border tech, and the human rights impacts of that. So there definitely is conversation at the international level too. So I would urge you to check that out if you want to read actually a really well-written report at the UN, which sometimes can be rare. Gosh, I shouldn't be taking so many digs at the UN, but you know what I mean. Definitely check it out.
Could you repeat the name of your colleague who wrote that article, please?
So her name is Tendai Achiume. Or if you just look up the UN Special Rapporteur on Discrimination, her report will come out. For those of you who might be interested in the more kind of anthropological, on-the-ground stuff, I also cite her report there. If you look up our report, it's called Technological Testing Grounds. You should be able to find it pretty easily. I would put it in the chat, but I realized that you physically are not there, so I can't share it with you online.
I'm just wondering whether in all of this you see any particular areas or governments looking and seeking to use technology to actually support and I suppose improve the experience and the movement of people across borders.
Well, perhaps I've become extremely cynical. My kind of knee-jerk answer would be no, but that's a bit simplistic. I think there are some governments where really there has been some more developed thinking on the human rights impacts of tech and how to mitigate some of the risks. While still, I have to say, the vast majority of governments that I'm aware of, again, the animating logic is that tech is good, we should be using it. If there are problems with the tech, we will figure it out. So again, this kind of logic that we should just start doing this, and if there's problems, we'll deal with it down the line. Canada, and I'm biased, I'm a practicing lawyer in Canada. It was one of the first countries that started to dabble with automated decision-making way back in 2018, which is actually how I fell into this random work. I'm not a tech person, which I think has come across. It really just came kind of by accident because we realized that Canada was experimenting with a lot of this stuff without any discussion of human rights or even privacy concerns. But then we engaged the government in really kind of deep critique and publicly and privately. And they did start to think about, okay, how can we, for example, introduce algorithmic impact assessments? So this set of assessments to try and determine, what is actually happening when algorithms and AI are used in immigration. What could a mechanism of redress or appeal look like? Things like that, trying to balance the human rights concerns with this so-called need to innovate. But then it's hard to kind of point to good examples and good practices because, you have something like that. And then a few years later, it comes out that the government was publicly lying and saying that they weren't using facial recognition at the airport when in fact they've been doing it since 2016 and potentially deported people out of Toronto Pearson's airport as a result of facial recognition cross-matching between Ministry of Transport databases and immigration databases. So pardon my cynicism, but it does seem like a lot of governments are really, really keen to test this stuff out, use it in different ways. And then when they're called out, and then it's like, oh, well, okay, fine, we will start thinking about human rights issues. But I will say, not to end on just like a cynical, pessimistic note, I think where a lot of the kind of helpful framings are coming from, and really the ones that need to be driving these conversations, are from affected communities themselves. How are people on the move using technologies? How do people want to talk about these issues? How can we see if technology can be used to, divert resources, open up more space for conversation, make room at the policymaking table for people with lived experience of migration? There's a lot of contestation and a lot of use of tech, particularly in the kind of communication space, by people who are crossing borders in really, really unique ways. I think that's an area where there's a lot of kind of just interesting ways that the technology is being used and co-opted and changed and reshaped in a way to kind of change the inequality of the power dynamic that's so inherent in bordering and in immigration. But with governments, not so much.
Can't hear us, but can you join me in saying thank you again? It's been incredible.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. It was a pleasure to be able to share with you some of my thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from you if you want to keep the conversation going. Maybe the organizers can share my Twitter or my email, and please get in touch. Thanks so much.
We'll do that.